So welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to design our lists activity layout in Android. This is essentially where we want to end up, that we got a button at the very top, and then we got a list view in here. And then for our list view, we also have at the bottom of it, we have another button. Very similar to what we did for our iOS site. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete both of these files that I have in here. You probably don't have one of them. I'm going to say remove and delete them completely. And then I'm going to go ahead and say Command N, that's to make a new file, or file, new file. And from the Android section, I'm going to choose layout. And this one I'm going to call lists layout. So this is the one that is going to make our lists. I'm going to hit new, and now we got a new one in here. Now, what's very important and you have to pay attention to is that each list layout should be connected to an activity. Each layout should be connected to an activity. Currently, I have an activity that's called the main activity, and that's not what I really want. I want to have it called lists activity, very similar to what we did for iOS, and we called it lists view controller. This one we're going to call it the lists activity. So I'm going to come in here and make a new file, say Command N, and for my Command N, I'm going to say it's called lists activity. So now we have a new activity that is my lists activity. And in my lists activity, the thing that I want to do in here is this. I want to say set content view to resource dot layout dot lists layout. So essentially my lists activity is looking at this layout for its content. If you look at the main activity, that is actually looking at layout.main, which we don't have anymore because I deleted it. There is also a little piece of code up here that is the main launcher and icon. So I'm actually going to copy this bit. Let me just close my properties altogether and toolbox. So I'm going to copy this bit, say all of these, all right, main launcher, and I'm going to take those to my lists activity and say like that. So essentially I'm saying this new activity called lists activity is also the very first launcher. It's essentially like saying is initial view controller in iOS. So this is the one that gets loaded at the very beginning. And now that one is looking at list layout as well. Of course, now I don't need the main activity anymore. So I'm going to delete that, remove, and delete completely. So now we have in the layouts, we have a lists layout and we have a lists activity. So now let's go ahead to list layout and start designing our interface. I'm going to go ahead and get view paths properties, and of course view paths toolbox, because I need both of those. And in the toolbox, I'm going to say give me a button, give me another button, and give me a list view. And I'm going to drop the list view between the two buttons. So if you look at your document outline now, you will see that we have button, list view, and button, but for some reason we can't see that other button, simply because list views, they attempt to take as much space as they can. And to manage that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my list view, go up into the layout and go at the very far bottom and change its weight to any number other than 0, say 0.5, and that's about that. So now the button takes priority and actually gets to be shown. I must also mention at this point that what I'm doing is I'm designing the interface using the widgets and style. You could very well, hard code everything through the source. If you come from a background of Android, or if you just prefer writing everything by code, you can do it. I'm simply choosing to do it in the designer because I find some stuff to be easier in the designer. So the next thing I want to do is I want to change the look of this button, the other button, and what's written on them. So I'm going to select the button at the top, go to the style, and in this style I'm going to say height of it is actually 64 dp. That is density independent size, which means it will be the same size irrelevant of what device we are using. And I'm going to go to the widget side of it and say this is actually saying plus new list, and is not all caps, so it becomes like that. Then I'm going to go to the style, and in the style I'm going to say text color is yellow, as it was for our iOS side. Text color is yellow. Why it doesn't autocomplete? Well, I'm just going to actually manually add the color. So I'm going to say the color is yellow, maybe that one, A700. Perfect. So that's the one. And the background color for it is going to be purple. So I've got the purple color. Perfect. For the button that I have at the far bottom, I'm going to say it says login. So that's that. Is not all caps. And also, again, its text color is actually black, and its background color is going to be orange. Very similar to what we did for our iOS side. And my login button also in the layout, it is 64 dp. Very, very similar to the iOS side. Maybe I just changed the size of the text on both of these. So the text size, let's see what is 24 dp. That's too high. So maybe 20 dp, maybe even 18 dp. So 18 dp, and of course here 18 dp. So now that we have our elements, I'm going to go and call them, give them their names. So this one is going to be called not button one, it's going to be called new list button ID, simply because in Android we have the elements in our interface, and we also will get access to them in our programming side. This one I'm going to call it grocery list view ID, or just lowercase id, and this one is going to be my profile button ID. So we got the names for all of those. The next thing is I don't want to see this little action bar, title bar at the top of my screen. So I'm going to change the theme in here. So I'm going to change the theme to be theme.holo.light.no action bar. Perfect. So theme is holo.no action bar. Keep in mind that changing it in here, it doesn't change it in your actual application. So when it compiles, it's still going to show us that little thing at the top. And to change that, we have to go back to our Android manifest. So I'm going to go to my Android manifest. And in the manifest, in the theme, I'm going to say my theme is at Android style, and that is theme.holo.light.no action bar. So that's about that. So you have to set your theme to make sure that that actually happens. So by now we have our list layout, and we have our list activity, and our list activity is looking at our list layout. And now we need to get access to these elements. We need to know which one is our new list button, which one is our grocery list view, and which one is our profile button. So these three elements, we have to essentially get access to them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my list activity, and I could probably close the document outline and properties and toolbox to get a bit of a better spacing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead up there and introduce three new elements. So button, I'm going to call it new list button. And I will have a list view that is going to be grocery list view. And I will have another button, and that's going to be profile button. So we have those three, and now we have to find them. So I'm going to go to my onCreate. If you come from iOS development, this is very similar to view did load. So in here, I'm going to say new list button is going to be a find view by ID. And I'm looking for a button in the resources dot id what resources dot id resource dot id sorry resource dot id and dot profile button or new list button. So for some reason it doesn't autocomplete for me. Let me make sure I have saved my lists layout. So I'm going to go in here and say save, and the IDs are all set. That's perfectly fine. Let's go now to lists activity, and in here I'm going to say find view by ID. Perfect. Of the type button and resource ID dot perfect new list button ID. So that's one. I'm going to actually say the next thing is grocery list view is find view by ID. Its type is going to be a list view, and that is the one that is in the resource dot ID dot grocery list view ID. We need these names only once and only in here. We're not going to need them almost ever again, so don't really worry about them. So the next thing that I'm going to use is, I actually made a mess in here. I'm going to do is I'm going to say profile button. That's going to be find view by ID. And again, I'm looking for a button. And what I'm going to look for is resource.id.profile button, of course. So that's about that. We got access to those three. I'm going to suggest that we put these three pieces of code and what's coming after them in a separate method. So I'm actually going to close my onCreate method, say that's closed there. But I do have a void, let's call it interface builder. And my interface builder does all of these things. So I'm actually putting them in a separate, method, and I'm calling that method at the end of my onCreate. So I'm going to say interface builder. So it's exactly the same thing, but it just helps me modularize my code a little bit better. So now that we have those, I'm actually going to have to add the new functions for them. If you remember our new list button and profile button, they were actually doing things in our iOS version. So in here, I'm going to say new list button click plus equal. So we're subscribing to a new method. So I'm going to use the arrow buttons to bring the method here. So now my new list button, when it gets clicked, it calls this method. What I want to see is I want to press the new list button. I want a little pop-up to appear. It's an alert view that's going to ask me for the name for my new list. So I'm actually going to call it that. I'm going to say new list alert view. And I'm going to say copy that name, paste it there. So now this method is subscribing, this click is subscribing to this method. So now that we have that, let's do the same thing for our profile button. So profile button plus click plus equal, make a new one, arrow keys, place it down there. And this one, let's call it profile action, which is very easy. So profile action. So now my profile button, when we click on it, it calls this method. And finally, I have to do the same thing for our grocery list view. Grocery list view or list views in general in Android, they don't have a delegation like what we have in iOS, for instance. So we have to actually manually handle the click on their items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say grocery list view dot item click. It means every time I click on an item on it, subscribe it to. So let's put it there. So what happens when we click on an item from our list view? So we want to go to see its specific, items. So I'm going to call this one, actually, instead of this long name, I'm going to say go to items. So that's the method. And of course, we have another one, and that is when we long click grocery list view, we want to delete them. So I'm going to say grocery list view dot item long click plus equal subscribe to a new method, and this new method I'm going to call it delete list alert. So essentially we want to see an alert that shows up and tells us, are you sure you want to delete it? Of course, we haven't done any of those. We just have prepared the methods for them. I know this bit of code became a little bit too long. Don't worry about it. I'm going to come back to this. We're going to explain each of them once again when we actually write the code for them. For now, let's just test our application. So I'm going to right click, say set as a startup. I have a shortcut, so I'm going to use that from now on. And if you're wondering how to set the shortcuts, you just go to your preferences and key binding. So, and then I'm going to run my application. And once my emulator loads up, I should be able to see everything that we just discussed. So in here, I don't have that title bar up there. I have a new list that when I tap on it, of course, nothing happens. Here is our list view that doesn't have any content. And here is our profile button. So everything is working exactly the way we wanted it and very similar to what we have in our iOS site. Let's keep it up to here and then we'll move on to our next lesson.